Hello and welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded land of the Kulin people of Nam, which we now know as Melbourne. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to them and their elders. If you're joining us remotely today, I would also like to acknowledge that many other people present in today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians, and pay my respect to those communities wherever they are as well. This morning's panel is titled From Head to Toe, the Language and Iconography of Chanel. In this session, we will discuss how the brand and identity of Gabrielle Chanel, that Gabrielle Chanel created, was so influential, and the role this played in its enduring success, the key elements that became synonymous with the style and language of Chanel ever since. I'm delighted to welcome my fellow guest panellists this morning, Christine Barro and Karen Webster, who will be helping me to explore this fantastic topic. Christine Barro is the internationally recognised, locally lauded doyenne of luxury retail in Melbourne, who springboarded a buying career at the legendary department store George's in a namesake emporium that sources and celebrates the world's most exemplary, extraordinary designs. She launched the Chanel boutique in the early 80s prior to their standalone store in Sydney. And Christine also introduced Fendi and Prada to Melbourne when Milan was but a blip on the fashion radar, and innovated with experiential retail long before the term was even coined. Karen Webster is the Dean and Principal of LCI Melbourne, part of one of the world's largest networks of design institutions with 24 campuses across the globe. Karen has been a key player, design advocate, and leading academic in Australia's creative industries over the past 40 years, including senior positions at RMIT University, Buzz Products, and Festival Director of the Melbourne Fashion Festival from 2005 to 2010. She has served on numerous government and industry advisory boards, including Chair of the Australian Fashion Council, and was the first female board director for the Council of Textile and Fashion Industries of Australia. And in 2012, Karen was inducted into the Fashion Hall of Fame. Before we get into the panel, I thought it would be a good opportunity to just give a brief introduction to the exhibition that hopefully most of you will be visiting today. And in doing so, begin to explore Chanel's journey into the realm of fashion. Gabrielle Chanel Fashion Manifesto focuses exclusively on the work of influential French couturier Gabrielle Coco Chanel. Curated by the Palais Galliera, the fashion museum of the city of Paris, with the support of Patrimoine de Chanel, the heritage archive for Chanel, the exhibition opened in Paris in October 2020. Visually sumptuous and spanning the breadth of Chanel's career, the exhibition charts the evolution of the famous Chanel style, a look best embodied by the designer herself. In exploring the characteristics of her work, her codes, and her legacy, the exhibition features over 100 outfits, as well as jewellery, accessories, cosmetics, and perfumes. Spanning 9 thematic sections, charting a loose chronology, the exhibition illustrates the spirit of freedom and defiance that characterised Chanel's design language through the 20th century. Exploring many facets of her work, the exhibition highlights how Chanel rewrote fashion conventions to transform women's wardrobes with her innovative ideas, pioneering approach to fabric and construction, and utmost consideration for the female form. Chanel devoted her life to creating, perfecting, and promoting a new type of feminine elegance, grounded in the reality of women's lives. This was her fashion manifesto, a design style based on principles of comfort, streamlined simplicity, and ease of movement that became a template for modern women. The exhibition itself begins with works from the 1916-17 period, around the time Chanel opened and found success with her first millinery shop, and ends and culminates with the last collection that she presented only weeks prior to her death in 1971. But on to the questions for today. I'd like to start maybe by just grounding the discussion in what do we really mean when we talk about a brand and its codes, and of course to go on to what does that actually look like when we start to think about Chanel as a brand.
Do you want me to start? Yeah.
By all means.
All right, I'll jump in first. So thank you, Katie. A brand represents those intangible values that you get from it could be anything, you know, it could be a food outlet. We all know brands that are food outlets. It could be a can of Coca-Cola. It could be a car. But in the case of Chanel, it's about also those quintessential codes. So in fashion, we often talk about the codes that a brand will have. And those are the things that you just think of. Like if I say the word Chanel right now, I bet every one of you have got a vision in your mind of something that comes to the fore. And what might that be? It might be the quilted bag. It might be the gold chain. It could even be the gold buttons. It could be the tweed that sat in her suits. The camellia is like the golden arches of Chanel. Like you see the camellia and you immediately know what it is. It could be the shape of Chanel No. 5's. You know, the bottle is so essentially Chanel. And I think more than any other designer that I can think of, the series of codes that represent Chanel come to your mind more than any other brand. Like I know we've had some amazing exhibitions here, like Dior, Victor and Rolf Gaultier that have codes as well. But even if another designer does a cropped tweed jacket, they still call it a Chanel jacket because it actually has, it's kind of embedded in her history.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think the House of Chanel, I like to say, stayed on point with Gabrielle's vision for women. Each item becoming a signature of her DNA, constantly evolving and improving her fashion evolution. So whether it be the man's pant, which I totally relate to, the tweed jacket, and of course the CC button that became part of its signature, and even when she did the little black dress, she just kept reworking that dress into many textures, and so the message kept coming through. And, of course, the introduction of jersey garments, that spectator sport, still playing the game of black stripe on cream. Then, of course, the Chanel No. 5, the attention they paid to even the stopper being the shape of Place Vendôme, even the watch being the shape of the face of the watch is the shape of Place Vendôme. So they were constantly thinking and evolving the message of the brand. And of course, the introduction of the quilted bag. I brought my little 80s bag along today and it's still perfect. And the boater hat, and then the spectator sport beret. Coco Chanel put women into these things. And of course, the sense of place, the purchase of 29 Rue Cambon and then 31. So you have this sense of a home and a place, and that cascading stairway that was so much part of her image. And then, of course, the addition of a jewel, the bijou. Coco Chanel collaborated with Robert Gaussons. They started in the 50s through to the 60s. And she'd say, when it's faux, it's got to be grand. And she mixed, you know, she put fashion jewellery, costume jewellery, they always called it, back with her real. And so it was this constant layering and expression and always available, the cross, the many options. I think that's it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me in listening to you both talking is there's something of the consistency of having I mean, we're talking with Gabrielle Chanel, you know, this is the First World War period onwards. It's a very long time to sort of hold an identity and an association. And I think most of the things you've spoken about, Christine and Karen, were present right from the start. I think that's what's particularly interesting about Gabrielle Chanel, isn't it? That right from the outset, she had these principles and these ideas that underpinned all of those things that have now become classics. And they themselves don't waver, but as you say, it's the sort of evolution of how they've been just tweaked and modified over the period, so they become almost second nature to us.
I'd love to share too also just the point of for her to introduce a fragrance, and I gathered that was her lucky number. But you see, my very favourite saying is, and she calls it the invisible accessory, I call it the ultimate accessory. Because if I'm looking at you and then I can smell you as well, that's adding to my view of you, you know what I mean? So it becomes this addition. And apparently it's our second last olfactory we lose before we die. So it's a wonderful sensory to play in how you're feeling and how you're dressed.
And I mean, interesting that for her, it wasn't that fashion designers hadn't had perfumes before then, but the fact that she associated it directly with her and her name and her identity.
And it was the first synthetic perfume. So I suppose the difference was that perfumes up until then were generally a singular floral scent, and she put something like 80 different scents together. So it was the first time that the chemical composition of a perfume came together to have something that would be so unique, that was really difficult to copy, that I think set her aside. And I wouldn't mind just jumping back to the idea of the consistency. Certainly now those codes are consistent, but often when we think of the Chanel today, and especially under the reign of Lagerfeld, it was quite eccentric and a little bit it had a lot of flourish to it, a bit mad now and then. But actually when Chanel started, you've got to think about that moment in time. Women were coming out of the Belle Epoque. They were wearing incredible, eccentric clothes, highly decorated, highly corseted and structured. For those in the upper echelons of society, they had maids that would dress them, and they'd often change 6-7 times a day. And Chanel kind of looked at all of this and went, this is craziness. I don't want to live my life like this. And she came from a poor background, so I think she looked at this world and thought, what are you doing? So she actually, in her early years, invented simplicity, utilitarian wear, functionality, and very well recorded of her love of menswear and borrowing from the boys. So she thought, why do guys get to wear a bit of a uniform, like these beautiful tailored structured trousers, these beautiful tweed coats, borrowed from sportswear, which had functionality as its core purpose, and then put it into fashion. And I think that actually, even though we see the consistency in the codes, the other thing about Chanel at that time was a sense of real streamlined simplicity and purity, which maybe we don't see as much today, but we do thank her for what she did for fashion at that point in time. She read the moment.
Yes, she was very forward in her vision, wasn't she? Very.
And interesting even thinking about the nature of brands and how they publicise themselves and the ways that happens. And there are a lot of parallels, I would suggest, perhaps in terms of how brands currently do that and what Chanel herself was doing in terms of using known figures, actresses, well-known models, and of course herself in particular. In the exhibition, you'll notice that we have a series of portraits throughout the exhibition punctuating the chronology, demonstrating Chanel herself embodying the Chanel look, you know, from all the accessories are there right from the start, and the colour palette, all the clues are there, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things in terms of marketing and publicity we can really thank her for is this construct of diversification. So if you pick up a copy of Vogue and you flick through the first how many pages, they're all ads, right? And they're ads of all the luxury brands. And what do they help sell? They're not selling the garments, they're selling a lipstick, they're selling a sunglass, they're selling the accessibility of wanting to buy into the luxury. And she was the first person to really acknowledge that. So she created makeup, she created creams, she created little compacts that you could put into your handbag and carry with you. So people could buy into the world of Chanel and the accessibility of Chanel. And we still do that today. We still buy that beautiful red Chanel lipstick because we want a part of that world. Or we buy the perfume. So that was a phenomenal concept and it buoyed her brand. It actually really helped build the brand.
And I think she was probably the first designer to understand that you're constantly repainting a picture of you, and that's how and why she introduced all these accessories, like, as you mentioned yesterday, the cream shoe with the black toe that doesn't cut the leg. So the height keeps going. I mean, she just thought on so many levels, and the fact of the quilted bag with the shoulder strap just freed a woman up.
And put little compartments in that bag so you knew where all your bits were.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
the functionality aspect was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do think, sort of rather cheekily, but nonetheless, I think Chanel today harnesses the power of social media, for instance, better than most. Tens of millions of followers, and I have no doubt that if Gabrielle Chanel was here today, she would be at the forefront of that as well, in terms of engaging people with this world that she created, and in particular women, obviously, because as a woman that was a sort of her lived experience and something that she really tapped into, as you've already both touched on. But I think it is interesting to also think about the role that, with branding, even just the way things are presented, the packaging, the logos, and that aspect of the identity too, the double C.
Immediately recognisable. Like if you see photos of her first stores, when she opened in Deauville in France, and she was at the forefront of what we now call resort wear. So she casualised fashion. Up until then, fashion in itself was really, there was nothing casual about it whatsoever. And so she captured this essence of it. But her first awnings were black and white. I also love the fact that she recognised when she started that magazines, like your Harper's Bazaar and your Vogue, etc., they were all photographed in black and white. So she knew that if she worked in black and white, it was going to actually show up better in these magazines. So she had an astuteness to her business practice. Yeah. Even though, like, when you go through the exhibition, she has worked with beautiful soft pinks and other colours and creams, but the black and the notion of the little black dress as we know it today is phenomenal, because it is an incredibly flattering piece to wear.
Yes, and that constant image of the black with the white CC and the beauty of the packaging, you hang on to it, whatever little thing you might purchase. It's special, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, that's one thing I think it's particularly obvious perhaps in the room that we've dedicated to the perfume and makeup and beauty products, because in the centre of that room, kind of glowing at you like the treasure it is the very first bottle from 1921, when that perfume was first launched in very small numbers. It was very exclusive, originally only for couture clients of the house. It was only several years later that it was produced in quantities enough to be able to be distributed beyond Paris and the boutique. But there is something about looking at that very classic crystalline form. It's almost like a bottle you have when you don't have a bottle, isn't it? It's so sort of clear and sharp, it's almost invisible. But it's the graphics and the presence, and then you look through those cases and you've got examples further into the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, right up to the 70s, and it's almost like a lovely sort of puzzle game, actually, to sort of test your eye to notice where those differences are, whether it's in the shape of the stopper, whether it's in the, you know, height and proportion of the bottle, but it's still so evidently of that same original sort of thinking.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Photography is something that, you know, you just mentioned in the context of the magazines, of course, which played an important role for Chanel early on, for Gabrielle Chanel in promoting what she was doing. And of course, with that, a lot of, as it is the case today, a lot of the people taking those photographs were the leading photographers of the day. So, you know, all of the names come to mind.
So she was also really astute in terms of who she mixed with. Because, you know, again, you've got to think, this is a woman from a very poor background who'd lived in a convent and had, once she, her first lover that we heard Paolo talking about before, who helped fund her first stores, she was immediately amongst the aristocrats and she saw a different world. But she was also one of the first to really mix with the famous artists of the time, the famous photographers of the time. She was appointed by MGM to dress both on-screen and off-screen famous actresses. We've heard the beautiful quote from Marilyn Monroe. So through association, she recognised very quickly that if she connected, befriended, mixed with a certain both cultural class and elite class, that it actually helped elevate her brand and put her amongst the people who were going to wear it. Yeah, and I think it still happens today. You know, the notion of celebrity is now, well, you know, it's constant, but celebrity endorsement is now the key marketing pathway for most designer brands.
And hers was, of course, much more subtle and soft than today. It's a bit overworked today, isn't it?
Well, it's just because it's so extensive, you know, it's through social media.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you can enlist the likes of Man Ray and Horse P. Horse to take the photos,
that's exactly
then
right.
it does put you in a slightly different
and Cecil
stratosphere.
Beaton, you know, did those beautiful portraits, exactly.
Yeah.
Gorgeous.
So I guess we've talked a little bit about this already, but it's interesting to think about, you know, what she's established in terms of those hallmarks in terms of the materials. There's the tweed, the jersey, and those principles of ease, apart from anything, practicality, you know, pockets, something that I'm always obsessed by. I think I think it's a general human right, really, that a garment should have pockets, you know, beyond even...
Again, you know, like I mentioned before but up until then, women's bodies were manipulated. So you either emphasise the bust or the hip, like depending on what era had come before. She completely simplified the dress, but in that simplification had to be perfection. So she was renowned for her sleeve because her sleeves were cut so perfectly that they moulded to the body, and she took all of her influence from sportswear, where sportswear was dressed, you know, you had to cut to the body so that if you were playing tennis or golf, you had to be able to move. And again, taking it from the classic men's jacket, which is meant to slimly, you know, it's a slim representation of the body. So she took all of her references and influences from that. But, you know, the first jersey that she worked with was from men's underwear, and she saw it as this beautiful fabric that could actually just be perfectly manipulated. So, you know, all of a sudden we're putting into couture men's underwear fabric. That's pretty radical.
I was going to say that, you know, it's sort of a double twist, isn't it? Because it's crossing the gender lines. We've got sort of masculine tropes being used in a feminine context, but as you say, Karen, we mustn't forget that what Gabrielle Chanel was creating at this time was couture. These weren't ready-to-wear garments that you could buy off a hanger, you know, ready-made. These are being made for individual women, made exactly to their size, several fittings. Yeah. So the idea of something as humble as, you know, a material used for your underwear breaching that gap and being used in the context of the most exclusive and luxurious form of fashion that anyone can access. I think, you know, that in itself, it's worth sort of pondering for a second. I don't know what the equivalent today would be. I think there's probably a few people wearing some, you know, cotton knit undies in the room right now, imagining a designer kind of working with that in a way that transforms it sufficiently for you to desire it as the ultimate luxury. I think it is a really important underpinning, isn't it?
And, you know, this has happened through decades, but at that time, I think it was you know, I've been thinking, even when I got dressed this morning, I'm not a wearer of Chanel. It's not a brand that I necessarily gravitate to. But all of a sudden I recognised as I got dressed in my maximalist way, and she was a minimalist, that I'm putting on a slimline skirt. Thank you, Chanel. You did that in the 20s and 30s. You took women out of hobble skirts and you put them into just very gentle skim to the body. I'm wearing boots that are based on riding boots. She took riding boots and jodhpurs and sportswear and made it into fashion. I'm wearing a collarless jacket. She created the collarless jacket because she loved men's cardigans, and she thought women need to have something that's really easy to wear. So the collarless jacket became that mix between a structured jacket and a cardigan. So she was famous for it. You know, and then I've got textured black on. Well, that's when you see the exhibition and how she worked with black and all the different textures and tones and how she made it come to life. And I thought, with the exception of my little Chanel earrings that were lent to me by a girlfriend, so I thought I'd pay tribute, the reality is I can thank Chanel for what I've got on today because she'd made those changes in fashion.
I think also just even buying Chanel, it opened up my mind to treat your wardrobe as items, the shirt, the pant, the skirt, and keep reinventing to your style. You're not bound, but you can have that beautiful Chanel jacket or the beautiful plissé blouse or all those additions, and you're then creating an image of you. You're not a victim to, dare I say, a brand. And I think Melbourne women are famous for it anyway. We do like to present our persona and be who we are, but within the lovely gift of the likes of a Chanel jacket or a pant or whatever.
Or even just thinking, you've both talked about particular colours there. You know, one of the, I suppose, the most striking aspects of the restraint that Chanel showed in developing this sense of her style and codes was in the limited colours. You know, it is the black, it is the navy and the cream, the occasional flourish of extraordinary red. It's not so much about print or embellishment, and in fact the embellishment is what you add through the scent or the accessories.
Yeah. But the jewellery, you've got to see the jewellery room, everyone. You're just going to, oh my gosh, it's incredible. So here was a woman renowned for restraint and simplicity and using men or sportswear cuts, so very clean lines. And then the excess came in these incredible pieces that were just like, you'll want every single one of them when you go into this room. But and what I loved is up until then, jewellery was worn for the evening. And she broke all of those rules by putting not just one strand of pearls, but incredible number of strand of pearls. And if anything, she put it on for the day. So all of these pieces were worn during the day. And if anything, she took them off at night. So at night, you just did shine in your clean, beautiful, long line black dress. You know, you might have had a little pearl in the ear, but basically she flipped it all around. So again, I probably can thank her for the maximalist approach in that.
And she developed that colour cabochon with Robert Gaussens because his atelier was about gilded bronze, rock crystal and freshwater pearl. And they developed that technique of putting a colour foil behind the rock crystal to give those wonderful strong emeralds and reds, but it's still the rock crystal.
Yeah.
And even in the placement of how she wore, particularly things like brooches, you know, often you look in photos and it's not the sort of obvious placement on the lapel. It might be on a sleeve or on a hip line or even on the skirt rather than the jacket. So it seemed to me that she was never content with playing by existing rules and was really, I suppose, very dedicated to pursuing what she felt, you know, people should be able to do, and in all its forms.
So even the suit that she became famous for, and there's again in the exhibition the most amazing room of the linear perspective of all those suits, which is incredible. But after the war, she'd seen that women were after the Second World War, both world wars had a massive effect on Chanel. The First World War was about women working and being more utilitarian, having to dress themselves. So that actually led into her style being really, she benefited from that First World War to an extent. But the Second World War, coming out of that, she saw the need to be able to dress women in such a way that they could work and be comfortable and have their own suit like men did. And the creation of the Chanel suit still exists today. Like that's what now, 70, 80 years later, we've got that incredible suit still in
And I think, I mean, the suit, we certainly have a whole room of 35 incredible suits, actually, including one that Chanel herself wore in the exhibition. But those suits are, you know, as you've touched on, really an extension of almost the more cardigan style ensembles that she was creating in the 20s and 30s. So this sort of enduring revisiting of something. And I mean, it's interesting to note when she did, in the mid-50s, kind of present the Chanel suit as we know it now, it wasn't universally adored and loved. You know, people sort of were initially, certainly in the fashion press, were a little aghast and thought it as being, you know, looking backwards and not at all kind of responding to the zeitgeist of the moment. But she stayed true to her idea, and eventually, you know, a sufficient number of influential fashion editors, amongst others, and young starlets began wearing these suits. And I think, I mean, that's the other interesting thing, isn't it, with a lot of these pieces, is that fashion can be quite an ageist phenomenon. And with something like the suit, she really did set out to create something that was equally appealing and accessible to someone in their 20s as it is for someone many decades further into their life. So, yeah.
I think Chanel is the best example of slow fashion, because that bag, that jacket is still adorable and wearable 20 years later in your wardrobe. Then that purchase is never wasted. Just only to do with size, if your size has changed, but at least the accessory is sizeless, ageless, perfect.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fabrics themselves, we certainly, when you think of the Chanel suit, the dominant fabric used is inevitably a tweed, a fine wool tweed. But even there, we have some fantastic examples in those 35 pieces that you can see on display that actually play with her own idea of tweed being central. There's one very beautiful example from the NGV's own collection, and it appears on first glance to be a tweed fabric like all the others. But when you look more closely, what we know is that it was actually a textured ground fabric that's then been overpainted by hand in these wonderful lines of hot pink and raspberry and red to create the illusion of a tweed. So it's this idea of, I suppose, sort of taking the concept and then pushing it further, either through extraordinary couture technique and kind of artisanal techniques, whether it's sort of embroidery or braid, to make it something extraordinary.
I think that's something that stands out in the exhibition, is the craft of Chanel and the technique, because by working within simplicity and purity, that technique is so elevated So you'll see, for example, the cut of a sleeve, or you'll see the drape of a skirt, and you'll see the fall of a blouse as being just so exceptional. And, you know, she was renowned for, in her fittings, of being a little acerbic and often not so polite, while someone had to sit there for hours on end being pinned till she got that sleeve or that collar absolutely perfect. And I think the attention to detail in every piece that sits in that exhibition is phenomenal. You know, I want to go back several times because you just can't see it in the first time you go through.
And actually, that's an interesting point you make, Karen, because thinking about, it's always interesting to reflect on how designers create. And what we know with Chanel, which is different to many designers, is that she didn't sketch. She didn't start kind of graphically putting pen to paper and conceiving of her idea that way, which many designers do, and they will then pass those designs on to the team in the atelier to translate into garment form. She was very, very hands-on. You know, this was as a woman, as you said, who would keep her mannequins statue still for hours upon end while she worked. Instead of working on a dressmaker dummy, she worked on the female form. So there's some fantastic footage actually in the exhibition in the first room that relates to a beautiful dress that we also have on display that shows her working methodology. And it is literally adding things, taking them off, taking to the pair of scissors, you know, rotating the model and manipulating on the body to actually get the outcome. So I think it's this idea of the experience of the garment being worn being very central to how she made her decisions.
And how important the body is. So, you know, when you sketch a fashion piece, you exaggerate it often. You'll just get the concept of it. But being a woman herself, in her early years, she tested on herself. And that was why all of these, you know, she was able to test the fabric, she was able to test the tailoring, and until she was comfortable. And when she kind of would stride out, and other women would look at her and they go, I want a bit of that, because like she's so comfortable, she can just walk freely, she's confident and relaxed in her own pieces. And I think that still exists today with not only Chanel, but her influence for
and
other
that's
designers.
a clever way, because a garment comes alive when it's on. So to be actually shaping it on a body,
absolutely,
you couldn't do better. Yeah.
And it actually reminds me of course, Chanel is someone for whom, you know, over 100 biographies have been written about Gabrielle Chanel, and we've all, in some part of our life, come across one of her quotes, either a legitimate quote or a slightly askew one, but one that she does sort of say on this topic, which I think is really pertinent, is if I don't wear it, I don't make it. So there's this direct correlation with her being almost her sort of test mannequin for her ideas, and that sort of laboratory of self, of trying things and feeling that unless it's something that you feel strongly about yourself to wear, then it's not going anywhere from her perspective.
I think some of her quotes are fantastic, but you've got to think also that Chanel didn't give interviews. She hated interviews. There's one famous one in the 1950s where she was being interviewed and the interviewer says, can you tell us what's happening in fashion this year? And she said, no, just boom. And they said, what, you don't know? She said, even if I do, I'm not going to tell you. And it was like, you know, so she wasn't necessarily about the self-publicity in how she spoke about things, but the publicity in terms of how she exuded a confidence or what she wore. And she thought that the clothes should speak for themselves, that she shouldn't necessarily be talking about it. And, you know, there's a famous word associated with Chanel that often comes up, and I think it's mentioned in the exhibition as well, is the word allure. And in, I think it was late 90s, early 2000s, the House of Chanel made a perfume actually called Allure, because that's what she was. She represented the whole sense of what allure is, yeah.
The other thing that I think at least one of you have mentioned is the classic red lipstick, the slash of red lipstick. And I think, again, that has become something we associate as being very distinctive. And, you know, interestingly, going back to our reflections on Melbourne, the wearing of black and a red lipstick, when I arrived here 26 years ago, I remember it was very evident. There was a sense of a kind of uniform, particularly if you were working kind of in the cultural or arts factor. And, you know, it makes me think that in a subtle way, what she is doing is creating a kind of codified uniform, isn't it? One that's not about limiting or restricting, though, but one that's enabling and freeing, and presents a platform and a kind of language for all of us that we've now just absorbed.
So even though she adamantly said herself she wasn't a feminist, but she did emancipate women in so many different ways. So I think that, you know, she definitely had, she probably compared herself to the suffragettes and didn't align so much with that. But she did really, from a business perspective, like even though she had a whole series of lovers that invested in her company, in her business, in her early years, she paid them back. You know, she saw them as providing equity. And, you know, it's like you would go and get an equity firm investing in you today. She knew that she needed the money. She knew how she wanted to spend it, and she knew how she would make the funds back, but she paid them back. And I find that fascinating in her whole spirit of how she worked as a woman in the business at the time.
I think Rue Cambon has such a strong part of her label too, isn't it? It's a very strong sense of place that she created. So it's the total illusion of the home and the garment and the scent. There's so many layers, isn't there?
You know, as a young designer in the 80s, my first trip to Paris and going and standing outside 31 Rue Cambon and just feeling so emotional because of the legacy of the place. So and seeing that staircase, you know, it's like you see a staircase like that, and that's another one of the codes that you always associate.
And I think, you know, it's very easy sometimes when you do talk about someone's work in great detail to forget to reflect back at what else is happening at the time. And I think, you know, Chanel, amongst other things, is very well known for warring with her fellow designers, yes. From, you know, Paul Poiret, who believed she was, you know, in this style that she created, which was using the colour black and quite sort of simple and chic. He sort of denounced this as kind of basically luxury for the poor. He was very rude about it, kind of likening it to, shop girls and clerks. And, you know, Schiaparelli likewise, they were not firm friends by any means. And then particularly if you think about that post-war period, someone like Christian Dior, who of course in 1947 famously introduced what was coined the new look, which was about taking the silhouette back to something that harkened back almost more to a 19th century silhouette with a very nipped-in waist and full skirts, and completely redefined the silhouette in a way that, as beautiful and popular as it was, what it did mean was women having to use a lot of foundation garments to create a shape which is not actually naturally reflective of their own body.
She was disgusted by Dior. She just thought it was... And, you know, the interesting thing is, thankfully, we have all of those designers and we can reference, they're all amazing. And don't we have choice? But by her sticking to her codes, like I was thinking before when you were talking about it, post-war, Dior had such an impact. And yes, it took her a while, but really she preempted the whole look for the 1960s much earlier. She was the one that, you know, once we moved into really clean line, simple, shorter skirts, and the structure of what we saw as the 1960s silhouette, she'd already been doing that 10 years earlier. So it's, you know, then Dior had to turn around and acknowledge that Chanel had actually captured the moment. But, you know, the beautiful thing about fashion is we do have choice and we can choose between all of these designers.
Yes, and I think the lovely thing that Chanel did create is that signature DNA, because, I mean, in the early 80s when I did some fashion workshops, I explained to people that, you know, it's very good to follow 2 or 3 designers that suit your style, because, you know, it all works back. And so your purchases are never wasted, and that's what Gabrielle Chanel did. She kept that continuity. And as we say, fashion's an evolution, not a revolution. So it's that evolving story she created that made it doable, very doable.
She probably came across as a bit of a revolution in the beginning, though, do you think?
Yes, yes.
I think that, you know, because you've got to think at the time, menswear had shifted significantly with the onslaught of the Industrial Revolution, and men started wearing suits. So the way men dressed from the late 1800s on still has stayed pretty consistent all through, you know, the notion of the male suit. But women were decorative, they were excessive, eccentric, you know, it was over the top. And for her to recognise that I want to take the tailored men's trousers, the sportswear coat, the jersey and cardigans, the tweed, you know, she went to Scotland and fell in love with Fair Isle and had used it then ever since. Thankfully, the Duke of Westminster bought her a mill in Scotland, which did help, another one of her famous lovers. But I think that at that point in time, there often a lot of the people that write about Chanel, they talk about fashion before Chanel and post Chanel, and that she was a defining moment in the contemporary woman's dress, or the female, how we dress today.
And I know, obviously, the exhibition that we have here at the NGV at the moment is focused purely on Gabrielle Chanel, and in fact the first exhibition to truly do just that. But it's probably worth sort of finishing up, maybe reflecting on her legacy in a different sense, because she does, working right up to the last minute, she does pass away in 1971, and Chanel continues. So what we had for a number of years is sort of a fairly quiet, dormant period before along came Karl Lagerfeld as a young man who was invited to come and take on the legacy of Gabrielle Chanel in the early 80s. In 1983, he presented his first couture collection for Chanel. And of course, there's a whole other story there. He was there for 36 years.
Wow.
So,
what was his first collection year, sorry?
1983, yeah. So there again, we have this kind of re-blossoming of a whole other era. And he certainly set out to obviously bring his own style, but interestingly, he was kind of a version of Gabrielle himself in the way that he chose to do that. He did ground all of his collections, one way or the other, in a kind of homage to those codes and those existing garment forms and materials that were established.
But he shook it up.
Took them in a different direction. So, what do you think about life after Gabrielle?
The thing I say about Karl is he was a unique beast. And he could wear Coco's hat and ooze Coco. You know, I've never known any designer to be able to do that. He did it for Fendi, he did it for himself, but he got totally into her DNA. Yeah. And I always said he should have been the Grand Dame, that hair back. I had the opportunity to just see him on Rue Saint-Honoré because I heard he goes out walking on a Saturday afternoon doing the store. So he was with his walker and went into the first English bookstore. And I felt like the paparazzi following him. That white collar, I think, was holding his neck up. It was that stiff. I gather they're collars that he discards each day. But yes, a genius. And I gather his mother was very sort of tough with him. She'd say, come on, hurry on, say what you want to say, I haven't got time. So for a creative person to have this Germanic order with his multi-brain was kind of a unique toughness in the fashion world. He could wear many hats.
But he was so successful at Chanel
Yes.
because of that structure, because he inherited those codes.
Yes.
And even though he punkified it in many ways, and but if you look at any one of those collections that, and even today, because even the house still continues today, because those codes stay strong. And whether it be the multiple layers of pearls, the camellia, the chain, the padded, like the bag, but he uses the padding through all of the accessories, on sunglasses, on little kind of leather, little jackets. So he was able to, every collection kind of delve into those codes. But also, because he was also a photographer, he would photograph or use again the famous photographers of the day. So everyone from Avedon to Paolo Roversi to Bruce Weber have photographed Chanel for Lagerfeld, and often they'll do it based using that incredible staircase, and they'll use it, the black and white awnings. So you'll see it, the continuation of all of those tropes as well. But I think every collection that Lagerfeld did, he always had a little black dress of some sort. And you've got to think, well, little black dress, what was it that was successful? One was that it was little, it was slimline, it was close to the body. And like you mentioned earlier, the black was, black was only worn for mourning or for servants. So in both those cases, Chanel took something that had not been done before and completely reinvented it, and he maintained that legacy.
I mean, it's interesting also because obviously perfume is a mainstay for the house of Chanel, and I think Chanel No. 5 remains probably the most popular perfume in the world. I gather a bottle is sold every 30 seconds, so that's something to think about. But it wasn't, may have been the first perfume, but it wasn't the only one. And in fact, when Karl Lagerfeld took over, the first fabric perfume he chose to launch was named after Gabrielle. It was named Coco.
Yep.
So his kind of mission was clear from the outset, and I think it's worth actually sharing with you all, after you've been in to see the main exhibition, we've taken the opportunity to also reflect with our own collection on the Karl Lagerfeld legacy, and we have a fantastic display, free display on the second floor in this building of bags from the period of Karl Lagerfeld, and you'll be able to see immediately all of those same styles as reflected in the image behind me with the chain, the quilted leather, but these are all I suppose best described as much more eccentric and idiosyncratic and playful versions of that same idea. One of them, in fact, is almost as big as me. It's basically a giant hula hoop that is also functions, would you believe, as a beach bag. And then there's ones that are tiny, the size of the palm of my hand. So I guess it does say something about, when you do genuinely develop a design idea that is powerful and compelling and draws people in, it is something that maintains and evolves way beyond its first inception, and is something that becomes recognisable to many people. I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time, so I just wanted to finish up by, I guess, thanking my fabulous guests here, but also just truly reflecting on what an extraordinary achievement, really, for Gabrielle Chanel. As you say, not at all formally trained, didn't grow up in an environment where she was surrounded by any of these ideas. She was ultimately someone who was a real self-starter, incredibly self-contained, never married, and never sort of, I suppose, gave more of herself than she wanted to, ultimately. And she lived for her work and her design. And it's just brilliant to be in a position to be able to really look closely at what that resulted in this exhibition with, I think if we count all the garments and all the accessories, all the incredible early perfume bottles and everything, it's well over sort of 230 objects in there that all stand testimony to the extraordinary contribution of one woman starting in the early 20th century. So enormous thank you to you both for sharing your expertise this morning and talking through some of those ideas. And thank you so much for joining us this morning, and I do hope you enjoy the exhibition. Thank you.